Hi everyone, welcome to week 3 and the start of our second unit, which is the civil rights movement. This PowerPoint that you're looking at right here is going to be the first part. I'm split it essentially into African American civil rights and then the other civil rights movements. Because when we hear the word civil rights movement, we're usually talking about African American civil rights, but there are a whole bunch of movements that are happening at this moment. So this is just the first part of it. All right. However, this week is going to look slightly different. And that is because I kind of want to set the stage for some of this material before we kind of jump into the civil rights movement. So this video should be pretty quick. I want to kind of set the stage for that stuff. And then I'm going to have you do a longer journal entry, and then we'll really jump into the content tomorrow. All right. I'm just going to put this up here for right now. I will keep adding to it. This is my favorite unit. This is where a lot of my research is, my personal reading and watching is normally on the civil rights movement. So the fact that we're doing this in 2 weeks through distance learning is personally heartbreaking for me, but I will try and give you all the other things. And so if there's more things that you want to look into, you have these options. So the first set is Hollywood films that have been made in the last, I don't know how long, 20 years. And then below that are some documentaries. Let's see, I will just point out 2 things. One, this Mrs. America is a brand new show. Not even all the episodes are out. It's on Hulu or FX right now, and it's about the Equal Rights Amendment. So you might want to check that out. And then the other thing is this Who Killed Malcolm X is a brand new documentary that's on Netflix. I don't love all of the historians or the activists that they use. I think there are some questions about their way of doing things, but pretty fascinating. So you might want to check those things out. All right. You should recognize these questions from our time together in the first half of the year. These are things you just might want to ask yourselves kind of as we move from the Cold War unit into the civil rights stuff. So number 1, based off of what you saw in the last unit, does it seem like the United States was a land of opportunity? If so, for who? Do we open up opportunity to anybody else at that moment in time? So you might think about the GI Bill and economic opportunities after World War II. The military, did we open that up to anybody else? Is there more people that could participate in that? While still being very conscious of those who get left out. What is freedom and who gets it? So you might think about freedom of expression. Did we increase the amount of people that were able to criticize the government or speak out, or did we limit that? And where do we kind of see that? You might think about that the first half of the Cold War, you see a restriction on people's freedoms, and maybe the second part, you see a little bit of an expansion, particularly if you think about maybe some of the anti-war activists. And then what is citizenship and who gets it? So again, thinking about, how do we participate in citizenship? Is it part of your citizenship to vote, to serve in the military, to criticize the government? And so where do you kind of see those things in the last one? And then kind of pay attention to maybe how are those things changing as we jump into this unit. All right. This is a little bit of a review, but going to be a couple important things for you to keep straight as we jump into this unit. Number 1, what's the difference between civil liberties and civil rights? So civil liberties are things that we are protecting from the government. So an example of that would be free speech. Your free speech protects you from the government. It allows you to criticize the government. Religion, things like that would be civil liberties. But civil rights are things that the government is going to protect for you. So for example, voting would be a civil right. The government is allowing you to do that or protecting that right. When do women get the right to vote? Or when do African Americans get the right to vote? So this is a key one for me. You really want to make sure that you remember this. Don't be that student that messes this up. So African Americans, men are going to get the right to vote after the Civil War. So in the late 1860s, early 1870s. Women don't get the right to vote until 1920, so 20 years or 100 years ago. However, they've already won those rights. This unit is not about getting people their right to vote. Legally, it's there. It's about enforcing that. It's making sure that people in reality can use those rights, can actually go to the polls and vote. Okay, what does Congress do? So Congresses are the legislative branch. Congress is one of our three branches. So their job is to make laws. Okay? They write the laws, and then after they make the laws, it's going to be the president or POTUS who signs them. They're the executive branch. Okay, so they can sign a law, they can veto it, which is essentially sends it back to Congress, or they can help convince Congress, but they themselves don't write the laws. The biggest thing they're going to do is enforce the laws. So they're going to make sure that they are carried out. So if there's a federal law that says you have to be, 21 to drink alcohol, it's going to be the executive branch through law enforcement, their branches or their parts of law enforcement that are going to enforce to make sure that nobody under the age of 21 is buying alcohol. Okay. All right, judicial branch. They're the Supreme Court. They're the ones that are deciding whether something is constitutional. Okay, whether that's allowed under the Constitution. Okay, so just trying to make sure that you're keeping those three branches straight. Don't be the silly person who makes a mistake about voting rights. Recognize the difference between civil liberties and civil rights. And then the last thing on here is just the difference between, or not the difference, but the power dynamics between the nation and the states. So we have a federal government, and so that is a national government, and they have supreme power, essentially. And that doesn't mean all-encompassing that they can decide everything, but that they have the power over the states. So one of the things that we're going to see in this unit, particularly African American civil rights, is that it is going to be the nation that is going to pass a law or make a decision, and they have to force the states to follow that law. So national law or national decisions trump state laws or decisions. So we'll kind of see that play out. So make sure you recognize that the nation has that power, or the federal government has that power, and there's going to be a lot of pushback on the states, particularly the southern states. Okay. All right, some more things. Just because something is legal does not mean that it is moral. Just because it's written down as a law doesn't mean that it's a good law. We might think about some of the things that we saw in the Holocaust or under the days of slavery. Those things were legal. It doesn't make them right. Laws don't change the past. So, for example, we can change the laws. We can get rid of things like slavery, but that doesn't change the long history of slavery and the consequences of those things. Laws are only as good as those who enforce them. So if we have a law that says don't murder people, but we don't enforce them, then those laws aren't very good. So we'll want to pay attention to, are we actually doing what the law says? And then also, should we? The last thing on here, law enforcement's job is to maintain the status quo. And the status quo is the way things are right now. So it is law enforcement's job to protect the laws as they are. And the reason that's really important is if laws aren't necessarily moral or aren't necessarily good, then you might have instances where law enforcement is protecting what we think is immoral or wrong. Particularly, you're going to see those things when we talk about segregation or things of that nature. Right, I'm going to move myself a little bit. I might be less likely to do this because we are digital or distant rather than together this term. But this is going to, this unit might anger some of you or make you a little bit uncomfortable. That's okay, that's to be expected. So just kind of as we go through that, I want to make sure that you understand that you are not responsible for what people of the past did, that you are responsible for knowing history and working to make a more equitable society. That responsibility is on all of us. And so just a couple ways that I think about that. I'm going to start with the quote where it says, unless. It says we can agree to disagree and still love each other unless your disagreement is rooted in my oppression and my denial of my humanity and right to exist. So essentially, we're allowed to disagree until what you're saying is calling into question who somebody is. So whether you're saying all people of a race, an ethnicity, a gender, or sexuality are less than is where we have an issue. And you'll kind of see that as we move forward. Some other silly things about how I think about that. Equal rights for others does not mean less rights for you. It's not a pie. So when you expand rights, whether again by its gender, race, sexuality, etc., You're not taking away from anybody else. You're just making sure that people have access to those same things that those in the dominant group have had for a very long time. And then when all else fails, this silly line from this song from Pharrell that says, the truth will set you free, but first it will piss you off. So some of these things might question the way you were raised, what you think you know, and so you might be angry or be like, Miss Edric, you're wrong. And sometimes those things take a little bit of time to set in, and then you'd be like, maybe there's something there. All right. So a little check for understanding. When we talk about racism and prejudice, they're different, and so we want to make sure that we're recognizing that. So prejudice is actually, I would say, maybe more common than racism. And that doesn't mean that racism is not a thing. You'll absolutely see that in this unit, but that there's a distinction between them. So prejudice is an irrational attitude of hostility directed against an individual, a group, a race, or their supposed characteristic. But racism is that prejudice plus power. So it's the reason why you talk about that if we are in a society where the power is in white America, then that's where you see racism. You don't see it go the other way because it's that power dynamic. So it's why we don't actually have reverse racism, or what you might hear somebody say that. That might be a prejudice, but it's not racism, because to have that, you have to have that power dynamic. All right. I'm going to kind of quickly go through Bella Baker. She's just really talking about that what we need is radical change. And so when we talk about activists at this time, they're going to be advocating for radical change. This is Johnson, and his way of describing that is something that you've seen. I used him for our first time together. And I want you to kind of pay attention to this. You'll see it less as we do distance learning than you would have in person, but I still think it's an important thing. I also challenge you to think about it where you might see it today in society. But he says, I'll tell you what's at the bottom of it. If you can convince the lowest white man he's better than the best colored man, he won't notice you're picking his pocket. Hell, give him somebody to look down on and he'll empty his pockets for you. So sometimes we don't understand or recognize that we are discriminating against somebody, and it actually hurts our own interests. Right. James Baldwin phrases this as, the history of the Negro in America is the story of America. It is not a pretty story. But Obama phrases this slightly more positive, and he says, it is in this embrace of truth, as best as we can know it, in the celebration of the entire American experience, where real patriotism lies. So being a patriot, a true patriot, not a misuse of that word, is loving the country and all of its good and bad, and recognizing and wrestling and coming to grips with all of it. Right. Bear with me. I really think that these things are important even as we are distant, because I think less so even about content, but more about just how we look at the world or how we address current issues. And you see that in these things. So number one, history is not stagnant. What we know about it changes. So a simple example, for a long time, African-American civil rights was taught as a male-dominated narrative. We now know that that's not true. It's much more complicated, and behind the scenes, women are playing a massive role. Reality is always more complicated than the narrative we use to comprehend it. This is obviously going to be very true right now. I have 2 weeks with you guys to talk about all of African American civil rights, and you can see my bookcase a little bit in the back, or you've seen it. I have hundreds and hundreds of books about these things. I can't possibly show you all of it or teach you all of it. So it's always going to be more than I can possibly give you, or that anybody can explain to you. No one gets to opt out of history. No Black history, no Native American history. It's our history, and we need to own it collectively. You don't get to say, I'm not Black, I'm not learning this, or I'm not a woman, I'm not learning this. This is ours, and we need to own it. Obviously, we have different relationships or connections to it, but collectively, we need to make sure we know who we are as a nation. Talking about racism is not anti-white. It's recognizing privilege. we need to be honest about what we as a country have done, and that doesn't make us anti-white or any of those things. It's recognizing where those power dynamics are and what that has meant for us as a country. Having said that, though, it's not just what happens to people, it's also their agency to make change. And another word for agency is power. So it's not just what's happening to people, it's also how they are fighting back against the things that are happening or trying to make change. And so you see that through social movements. And the civil rights movement is a social movement. We often see that there's a bad situation and people organize to make change. And then when that change happens, there's new things to work on or new angles that you have to approach things. So you see social movements will then change, okay? New challenges or new resistances. Okay? And then don't assume that everyone believes in the same path to freedom, that there's a spectrum. And so particularly in African American civil rights, you will kind of see that. You'll see kind of the MLK stuff that you were probably pretty familiar with. And then we will talk about other people that are fighting for similar things or for civil rights and civil liberties, but in very different ways. So we're not going to overgeneralize and be like, all Black people were fighting it for this way, or all women were fighting for this way, because that's actually not true at all. All right. Please don't forget that CO is like the Disneyland of diversity. Again, much like Disneyland, CO is closed. But we are in one of the most diverse school districts in the country. And so when we look at our population, we're incredibly diverse. And while we have issues at our school, they are at least less obvious than they are in other places. So just because you're like, oh, well, there's no racism at CO, there's no sexism at CO or whatever, that doesn't mean that they don't exist in other places or that other people aren't experiencing them. I will not go into great detail here. You can ask me later if you want. I was very naive when I was your age. I did not think that race or gender were problems. And then I moved to the rural South, and you want to talk about seeing racism or sexism or any of those things on a daily basis and a personal level, more gender obviously than race, it was very, very, very apparent. So just one little example, I had a professor in college who talked a lot about gender, and I was like, women, be quiet, women are fine, there's more women in college, everything is fine. And then I moved to rural North Carolina, and I tried to buy a car. And I had just gotten married, and the car salesperson would not look at me, would only talk to my husband. And even though the car was for me, it was my money, all that sort of stuff, women were meant to be seen and not heard, despite the fact that it was for me. And I was so appalled that I hated that car from the moment I drove it off the lot, because I recognized what was happening, but I needed a car. And so I let it happen, or I put up with it. Another really quick one, I tried to open a bank account with my husband, and the bank teller asked if it was legal for me to have a different last name, or whether if that was okay, so that I, in her eyes, needed to be property of him. And you guys know me well enough to know that that did not fly with me. But these were things that I had not thought about or experienced, and it was little in the grand scheme of things. But again, just because you don't see it in your life right now doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Okay. These are just some major things that media things that were put out in the last, 40 years now, that kind of altered the way that we think of particularly African American civil rights or African Americans within American history. And that's important because these are narratives that we're telling ourselves about the country and who we are, or what people experience. And they're making choices about what stories we tell, what stories we don't. And so the two of those are Roots, which is in the 1970s. Ask your parents or your grandparents about Roots, because it was a major deal. The other ones is Eyes on the Prize. And Eyes on the Prize is really important. It's all free online. You can find it. It's about the civil rights movement, but it's the first time that somebody took a collective view of the civil rights. So some of the early work on helping us tell a narrative over time of what happened. And so there's criticisms of these works, but these are really important about how we do that. And also, you guys know, like, media is important. Like, if this is what people are watching, this is the collective stories we're telling, it's hard. They're important, but it's also hard to branch out from those narratives. All right. We can talk about civil rights without actually talking about MLK. We have been programmed since we were little kids to focus on MLK, or Martin Luther King. And he's incredibly important. I'm not arguing that he's not, but he's not the only one. And we miss part of the importance of the civil rights movement and all the people that were necessary to make change if we just focus on him. And I will argue later that there are some more nefarious or troubling reasons why maybe people have wanted us to just focus on MLK and not the sheer numbers of people that were organizing and making change happen. So I'm going to challenge you to think about some other voices, some voices you are less familiar with, or some people you maybe haven't heard of, because they're equally as important. And then the last thing on here is it's not just violence versus nonviolence. Again, this is something that's been put into our head, but that's not the way it works. It's not just these either or things. So we focus a lot on King's nonviolent direct action, but it's not like it's just King's nonviolent direct action and violence. Like there are lots of other things. So make sure you're thinking about that. And I'll try and do a better job than I have in the past of kind of pointing out where you see that. Okay? But it's not just like King's on violence and everybody else is out like destroying things. So that's not how it works. All right. So this is the part where we're getting to what your assignment is for today. So there are some words. We might have heard these before. Assets. I'm not going to read all of them. You can read them later. Essentially, is all the positive stuff that you own. So anything that is worth positive money. So your house, what's in your bank account, your investments, those sort of things. Okay. I'm going to skip equity for just a second. Liabilities. Those are things that cost money. So debt, mortgage, car payment, all those sort of things. Okay. Debt when you owe money. Your net worth, what you as a family are worth, or you as an individual is worth, is going to be all of your assets, all of your positive money, essentially, and you're going to subtract all of your liabilities. Okay? So, for example, if we're just talking about, I don't know, my bills for the month, my assets is my paycheck, and my liabilities is like my mortgage and my car. For simplistic, the leftover is my net worth for that month. Okay. I'm going to forewarn you, you can have negative net worth. If you have a lot more debt or liabilities than assets, you can have negative net worth. One of the things that I'm going to have you look at is housing, okay, or people's, how that kind of plays into their net worth. And so when we look at that, one of the things that we see is something known as equity. And equity is essentially the value that you build up into your home as you pay it off and as it's worth more. So, for example, when I first buy my house, let's say my house costs $100,000 because I got real lucky. Okay? But I still owe $100,000. I haven't made any payments on it. Then my equity is $0. Okay? It's not. There's no extra value in it. Right? But let's say I have paid off that $100,000. They don't owe anything on my house. And now the market says it's worth $200,000. Then my equity is now $200,000. Okay? So your equity should go up as the value of that house goes up and the amount that you owe on it goes down. Again, these words are here for you. They're going to be on the assignment as well. So these are just thinking about your net worth as well as some of these financial terms. All right, oops. So what you're going to do is, let me pull this up here. You're going to go into your journal for today and you so there are those vocab words again. You are going to look at these families. On yours, it hopefully will be a better format. But essentially what you're going to do is you're going to take all of this family's assets, you're going to add them up. So you're going to add up all these numbers, okay? And then you're going to add up all of their liabilities, okay? And you're going to subtract their liabilities from their assets. And you're going to do this for these 3 families. Okay. And then you're going to put that right here. I will forewarn you. Wow, that I can't spell family, apparently. I'll fix that. One of these families will be negative. Okay. So 2 of them will be in the positive and 1 of them will be negative. After that, you're going to tell me what makes the biggest difference in their net worth. Okay, think about what thing is worth the most or is costing them the most. Okay, what's making the biggest difference in their net worth? Okay. Where did my PowerPoint go now? There we go. Okay. Then the next thing you're going to do is on that same paper, you're going to look at what is called internalities and externalities. So the internalities are things that are solely your own ability. So you are in total control. Okay? Externalities are things that are outside your control. Okay? You're going to just label those I or E. Okay? So for example, internality. Maybe you think an internality is deciding what you're going to wear today. That is totally in your control. Maybe. Okay? Externalities. The weather. You don't have control over the weather. Okay, so that's going to be an externality. Okay? And then the next thing is a self-worth audit. And let me go ahead and pull that up. Oh, wrong one. Here we go. Sorry about that, guys. All right, so those are those internalities and externalities. You're just going to label those. You're going to look at this self-worth audit. You're going to just look at these and you're going to decide how many of these apply to you. And you're just going to tally it up. You don't have to out yourself. Okay? You're just going to give me a total. You don't have to tell me specifically which one of these apply to you. And then you're going to answer these critical thinking questions, okay, about this. And the last thing you're going to do is you're going to watch this film. Okay? You're not going to watch the whole thing. If you want to, more power to you. I don't think that you're going to do that, though. It's, I think, about 25 minutes. I know I'm asking you to do a little bit extra today. Break it up into 2 days if you need to, whatever works for you. I only have these 3 questions that I want you to think about. Okay, let me go back to my PowerPoint and go over the last couple things. Okay. Just really quickly on that self-worth audit, they're going to ask you a couple questions. So one of them, they're going to ask you about if your family could buy a house in any neighborhood. So think about whether there was a law or intimidation or anything that would prevent your family historically to have bought a house. So particularly if you are African American or part of your family was African American, at one point there were laws or intimidation that was used to prevent your family from being able to buy a house in a neighborhood. And that's different from whether your family had the money to do that. It's that legally or in reality, people were kept out of neighborhoods. Okay? The next, there's going to be a question that is asked about your interaction with police officers or something like that. So I have some examples listed up here. I won't go over all of them with you. I'll just give you one example. So when I just graduated from high school, this was right when they passed the laws where you can talk on your phone. This is my cell phone, apparently. And I was talking on my phone. I didn't have my seatbelt on. I was speeding, and I didn't know that the police officer was trying to pull me over because I was an idiot. What should have happened? I should have gotten in a lot of trouble. I was breaking all sorts of laws. But I got a warning. Whether it was because of my age, my race, my gender, I will never know. But law enforcement treated me one way, and I want you to think about whether you would have been treated the same way. Okay? And then the last one on here is affirmative action. Affirmative action, which we'll talk about in our last unit together, but it is essentially how we've seen the country or places in the country try and make up for past discrimination, right? If we talk about that slavery was 250 years long or however long it was, I don't know if my math was right there, sorry. just because we stopped it doesn't mean that we got rid of past discrimination or Jim Crow or segregation or those sort of things. So affirmative action is trying to make up for those things. We see it differently along race or gender most often. So trying to make up for those things. So this is like maybe in hiring or college when you take either gender or race into consideration to try and do that. So one of the things. All right, I apologize for the weird jump I just did in the video. I'll mess something up. But these are the last things that I need to tell you before I release you to go watch your video. All right. At the top, you just see the name of the film. It's called Race, the Power of an Illusion, and the episode itself is called House We Live In. So two things. One, race is a social construct. What does that mean? It means that we as people make it. We construct it. It's not a biological thing. It's not a genetic thing. It's something that we as people have decided. And so we know that this has changed over history as well as geographically. So how we classify people in the United States is different than other places, et cetera, et cetera. Historically, we've actually talked about this a couple times. One, when we talked about different European ethnic groups, those used to be referred to as different races. So Italian versus German, those would be considered different races. Now we would consider all those people to be white. We also had something called a one-drop rule in like the slavery era, and that essentially says if you had one drop of African blood, you were considered African or Black. And so we obviously don't have those today. So what it means has changed. The other thing to go along with that is that this film, and really a lot of what we are going to talk about are the consequences of the things that we're going to talk about this unit, have to do with what is called institutionalized or systematic racism. So these are societal patterns. This is not individual. This is not somebody that is as an individual acting racist or derogatory or terribly towards an individual or a group of people based off of race, but it's a system that is oppressing or repressing a group of people. So they're dealing with more of the negative consequences of society. And so in the United States, we see that when it comes to health, we see it when it comes to the economic or financial considerations, when it's the criminal justice system, voting, all those different things. We're seeing institutionalized and systematic racism that is perpetuated even when we might talk about lots of victories that we have won or that people of color have won in the United States. So again, that's very different than what we think about as the individual or the racism that gets a lot more media attention because it's easier to see and it's easier to understand than the systematic stuff, which has deeper roots and it is harder to dismantle. All right, so this is the last thing, and then I'm going to cut you loose. Go watch your video. Go take care of business. There's a link. You shouldn't need an account. If it gives you any trouble, please let me know. You're not going to watch the whole thing, just the last part. I think it's about 25 minutes long. If you want to watch the whole thing, more power to you. I'm going to apologize ahead of time. Slightly outdated, but I think it is really, really important. It's going to talk about housing policies in the United States and the long-term consequences of that. And I think it's something that we need to talk about more as a country because we deal with its repercussions on a daily basis. It's kind of setting up the foundation for a lot of the inequality that we see today. Don't forget to do your post-reading questions on your journal. And then I'm done. If you need anything, let me know. I talked longer than I wanted to, so I apologize. I'll see you all later.